Welcome to the Victoria Rumble Room, a show that covers issues in Greater Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, the world. And I'm Robin Adair. Across town in Saanich, his lair, is Jolton John Juricic, the Croatian sensation. How you doing, John?
Fantastic. I will never be able to match that well-articulated introduction. Never. However, you forgot to add on a piece to where we're broadcasting. You know, we're living in this heat wave, holy mackerel, and all of the implications of what that is. But there's this meme running across the internet, and where there's this sort of a picture of the solar system, and there's the sun, and then Earth, etc., with BC closer to the sun. So in fact, we're broadcasting across the universe.
Well, that's inspiring, John. That's inspiring. We've got a lot of stuff happening, though, right here. Forget about the universe for a minute. Let's talk about what's been going on in British Columbia. In a few moments' time, we're going to have a representative of the protesters about the old growth forest situation in Ferry Creek. And the discussion there is very, very loaded, and it's still ongoing. There's a moratorium for 2 years about further old growth logging. The protesters are still there, so there's lots to talk about. But before we get into that, I just want to talk about the woke society. Has it gone too far? I just feel it must be going too far. There's anger, such anger from activists, and most of them are white. They're speaking, they say, for the First Nations, and because they're upset about residential schools and other inequities, they are burning churches around British Columbia. There have been, I believe, 5 churches completely destroyed and a couple of others seriously damaged. There have also been protests where statues have been defaced, like Queen Victoria in front of the legislature, and Captain Cook actually ripped down from his pedestal and thrown into Victoria Inner Harbor. And I think it's a terrible thing that we're facing. This is just out of control, and it's not sanctioned, John, by the First Nations.
Okay, let's deconstruct this a little bit, okay? So I've been obviously, we've been meeting our friends, we chat about things, we chat about current events over the last month or two, as we've been able to with finally COVID sort of enabling us to do that. And everyone is feeling unsettled. It feels very unsettled, really symbolized by Canada Day, that there were a lot of folks wondering whether or not we should celebrate Canada Day, which I firmly disagree with. I think we absolutely should celebrate Canada Day and everything associated with that. But let's start to really figure out what's really happening. There are folks who are making a business of protesting, and this is not new. This group of anarchists and folks who want to destabilize society, of which arguably there might be at most a dozen, maybe connected across the world through social media. These are the folks that are committing crimes, and they're symbolizing them to be something else. There are massive issues, appropriate issues that as Canadians we have to deal with. And anarchists, protesters, criminals are taking advantage of these vulnerabilities and causing crimes. It's that simple. Simple, simple. You don't just go to Captain Cook and remove Captain Cook. That has to be organized. You have to have the right tools. You got to know what you're doing. And police reports are indicating that, in fact, that's exactly what happened. Folks brought the appropriate tools to cut that statue down. That just doesn't happen arbitrarily, okay? So is it really a woke society? No, it is numerous folks causing isolated bits of trouble, which are now, I think,
heightening tensions for sure.
And happening across the country. Those are all organized. These are all organized by, let's call it what it is, criminal organizations, okay? Separate from that are real issues around First Nations reconciliation, around economic development, around climate change, real issues that you and I are trying to talk about on the show regularly. But this issues around crime have to be treated exactly for what they are. They're criminal activities. And let's support our police force and to help eliminate them and find the perpetrators. Now, along the way to the races, our city council, who I have numerous times stated on this show, for councils, municipal councils, stay in your lane, stay in your governance lane. And what do we find out today? They're debating wrongful conviction day. Of all the things to be talking about.
This is Lisa Helps in her Victoria Council we're talking.
Correct. Yes, yes. You can see that I'm getting a bit roused up about this. How about these days? How about lower property tax day? How about more affordable housing day? How about lower crime day? How about support first responders day? What about help the tourism and hospitality day? No, no, no. Today is wrongful convictions day. I'm telling you, Robin, this is not very complicated. Criminals are conducting criminal activity, and they are messing up the emotional turmoil that all of us as Canadians are feeling.
I just want to say that Paul Nicholson, who will be with us in a few moments, who's with the Rainforest Flying Squad and has been part of the protests up at the Ferry Creek location for old growth forest, does not stand with this kind of activity. And he does have some things to say about the anger behind some of this action. So that'll be interesting to hear. But I want to make it clear that I think these people who are being arrested in large numbers up at Ferry Creek, it's a separate issue. They've decided that they are prepared to stand on principle and be arrested on principle, but they are not actually causing damage. They are not destroying property. And I think it's a very different thing that they are doing at Ferry Creek. And for the two things to get linked in somehow is a disservice to all the people that are up there and protesting. And I just want to also say, John, that before we go a little further down that trail, I just want to give a little sneak preview to something else we're going to be talking on the show that's more positive about what's going on in the woods. We've been talking about the war in the woods, and we're talking about all this social upheaval. A little later in the show, we're going to be talking about how you can get out and work off all that tension. You can go for a nice long hike, because there are many hikes to take on Vancouver Island. There's a trail association that's done a tremendous amount of work on this, and we'll be speaking in a little while to Liz Bicknell about just that.
It's about 85% complete, I would say, Robin. So what this will be is 800 kilometers of through hiking, starting right here at Anderson Hill, all the way up through Cowichan. I've hiked this section myself. And there are some stumbling blocks that we've got, but we're confident that we will actually overcome those.
Yeah, you're right, Robin. Liz Bicknell, the president of the Vancouver Island Trail Association, will be here in a few minutes to talk about trails on Vancouver Island. So many folks, I see them posting on Facebook and all kinds of social media sites. They're posting, of trails and places. Like, how do you get there? Well, they get there by these beautiful trails. And it certainly sounds like an amazing way to keep fit. But now let's move on to our first guest.
Yeah, we're going to be talking now about that old growth protest that's been going on for quite some time on Vancouver Island. I got the activists and the First Nations, industry, and the government at loggerheads. There's been 260 arrests and 3 First Nations caught right in the middle of this whole big mess. And, John, in terms of a desired relationship with our Indigenous people, the objective is often described as reconciliation. That's the word you keep hearing over and over again. My understanding that reconciliation in the context that's expressed by our First Nations is that we as Canadians acknowledge that they have had a raw deal within our society, that we did at one time attempt to assimilate them and eliminate their culture. We did this through residential schools, and that was wrong. That was wrong. And that's the negative result that we are now seeing today, shown in so many different ways. We want to see that corrected. We want to see the First Nations take their rightful place in our country. However, we come back to the word reconciliation. And when it comes to burning down churches, all of the churches they've burned down actually on First Nations land, several of them built by the First Nations themselves. And when we talk about ripping down statues or covering them in paint, well, that's not reconciliation, that's anarchy. And it only just serves to divide us. It's not what Canadians stand for. It's not what we want to be as Canadians. And the definition of reconciliation, when you look it up and you see reconciliation in the dictionary, it says it's the action of making one view or belief compatible with another. And I believe this principle should be applied to our current war in the woods. I don't think we're asking too much for all the parties up at Ferry Creek to sit down and discuss this and work out something that's amicable. And I know the Pashadat would like to do that. I've talked to people from Ferry Creek. They've expressed that interest. I think this is something that could be done. And I think that most Canadians want to see the old growth forest protected. So there's no argument there either. But we need to step back and let the First Nations into the decision-making. It's really their territorial decision. If we're going to recognize the First Nations, we got to give them the tools. And Indigenous governance needs to be modernized, John. We're still working off a playbook that comes from the 1800s, the Indian Act. What's the deal with the Indian Act? We're still using the word federally, Indians. Well, where does that come from? That comes from 500 years ago when Christopher Columbus mistakenly arrived in the Caribbean and thought he'd arrived in India. So he thought these are Indians. Well, we've had a little while to figure out that they're not, and yet we still have the Indian Act. We still have the Federal Department of Indian Affairs. At the very least, we've got to change some names around here, but we also need to change this formula. Let's reset this relationship. Let's genuinely support our Indigenous people, help them rediscover their heritage and their culture, and give them the voice. And to me, this is the true reconciliation, and anything short, we can't settle for.
Woo! Brilliantly articulated. Brilliant. Robin, I've worked now for 3 or 4 years as a consultant with the First Nations communities around employment-related activities. If you're to do that successfully, you have to begin to understand, what does reconciliation mean to all parties? You have to understand the Indian Act and where some of these truly terrible activities started. Well said. Fully support all of what you've articulated moments ago. Let's settle for nothing less. Well said.
Thank you, John. And you know, the guy we're going to have on now, Paul Nicholson, is a very thoughtful man who I've known for a long time. I know he believes in reconciliation, but perhaps in a different way, as we'll discuss. I have known Paul Nicholson now for, it must be 30 years. And he was at the legislature when I was a reporter back in the 90s. I was there in the 90s as a legislative reporter, and he was a government relations consultant. Before that, he worked at the Victorian newspaper and later the Vancouver Sun.
Whoa!
Yeah, he's now retired, but he's hardly inactive. He had triple bypass surgery about a year ago, but he's got himself totally re-engaged in the Rainforest flying squad. He spent a great deal of his time up at Ferry Creek with his wife, Catherine, at the blockades there to save old growth forests. So now, without further fanfare, let's zoom Paul Nicholson in.
Well, welcome to the Victoria Rumble Room, Paul. It's such an honor to have someone of your reputation and esteem joining us today. So thank you very much for taking the time. It's fair to say, I bet you've seen a few of these land and logging disputes over your long career. So we're just curious, why now? Why so passionately involved in the Ferry Creek dispute? There's been a lot of stuff going on. There's been arrests. It's not somewhere that some folks might want to go up and hang out. Even your wife's been arrested. Tell us what's going on.
It goes back to I'm old enough that I was out protesting the Vietnam War, and I suffer injustices badly. I cheer for the underdog. I think that's one of the reasons I became a journalist. It was just a desire to make things right. My wife and I decided to just go see what was happening. Well, actually, she did first. She drove out to Ferry Lake, and she got all caught up in it, which is easy to do when you see what the people are doing out there. And so she came back and said, "We got to do something." And we contacted the Rainforest Flying Squad, and they said, "Well, you know where we need people is up at Kaikus." So my wife and I rented a camper, and we went up to Kaikus, and we stayed there. Well, she stayed there for 7 weeks. I was up there for I ran some medical stuff, so I came out early. But while we were there, and particularly reports I was getting back from my wife was the way the police are treating people, the way the arrests are being done, the whole thing, and the limited amount of land, and the destruction of the ecosystem, that we'll never see these trees again. Like, even if we wait 800 years, we're not going to get the forest giants anymore. Once they're gone, they're gone. The ecosystem it doesn't have the right materials to nurture that kind of tree to grow again. And so we're down to somewhere between 1.5% to 2.5% of old growth left. So we thought, well, damn it, let's do something. We got to do it. So I just got caught up in it, and we both joined the Rainforest Flying Squad. I've helped out with some press releases and helped organize the event June 11th. We can talk about that, because I know you guys commented on the splashing of red paint on Queen Victoria at one point.
Yeah, we've got questions for you about that coming up.
Okay, so I was involved with that, and my wife has been out in the camp. She got arrested, and after she got arrested, she was refused permission to leave. So she just sat there as an observer, and she watched the attitude of the police with the Native Indians, with the First Nations, and there is a deep-rooted racism there, and that's a strong accusation to make against the RCMP.
Well, I want to, before we get into that too far, then I think it's important that we do mention the First Nations in maybe in a different context.
Sure.
And Paul, you and I go back enough that we both remember pretty clearly what happened in Clayoquot Sound. At the end of Clayoquot Sound, the Nachalmouth stepped in and said, "This is actually our land. We make the decisions. We want everyone to leave." And that was how I recall the Clayoquot Sound situation finally came to an end, because both sides, both the government, the forest company, and the protesters all recognized they didn't want to be challenging the legitimate right of the First Nations to make decisions on their land. Now the protesters at Ferry Creek are facing a similar situation, where you have three bands, both hereditary and elected chiefs, all standing there saying, "We want to make decisions. We want this power back." We keep hearing about colonialism. It's the great catchword. Every time I open the paper, somebody's writing about colonialism. Well, part of the way of overturning colonialism is to give First Nations back a say, at least, on how they want things to proceed. So why don't the protesters respect that? Why don't you sit down at a table with the First Nations rather than holding campsites? And I realize roads aren't being blockaded to the same degree now because there's not the logging up there right now. But shouldn't the First Nations have at least an opportunity to make decisions that you can live with?
Of course, absolutely, 100%, and that's the policy of the Rainforest Flying Squad.
But you're still up there.
They're still up there because it's not the internal workings of the First Nations group are not clear. And what you have is the band councils, which were put into place under the old Indian Act, which are very patriarchal and very powerful, and they have limited the power of the hereditary chiefs.
But the hereditary chiefs I saw hereditary chiefs at the same table with the elected chiefs. There wasn't a division. We've seen that division with some of the pipeline dispute, but I haven't seen it with this dispute at Ferry Creek.
But what Elder Bill Jones is,
yeah, but he's elder. The elder is not a chief. He's not a hereditary chief. And there's always going to be people that take contrary positions in anything. I mean, that's one of the greatest things about being Canadian. There's always going to be somebody protesting something, right?
Well, okay. Well, let's get back to the root of this is protecting the old growth forests.
Right.
The senior, I forgot the title, about the Grand Chief of British Columbia, whatever it is. He made a statement saying that the protection of the old growth is more important than individual native bands, and that's caused more confusion. But what you get is the government has put in place deals with some of the bands to get some of the resources from the harvesting of the woods, and it's paltry. It's the Patchadat are getting $240,000 for their share of the royalties, of which, as you know, Teal Jones has said when they're complaining about the logging that they're losing $20 million, and meanwhile the natives are getting this paltry amount. And they're told to shut up about it. You can't make any statements. If you make any statements, the deal's off, kind of. And so this tiny band, one of the poorest bands in the country, are the Patchadat, and they're desperate for funds. And so they have bought into this, but they've been coerced into it.
So Paul, if I could just go down this track a little bit, okay? So all three of us have been involved in communications literally all our lives, and fully aware of the power of optics and the power of picture and the power of the 5 or 10 second clip on TV, right?
Yes.
And so I get you're not the leader of all of the protesters. I get that you're not, there's not a governance structure. Nonetheless, most people think protest, they're all part of the same group. And then when the Queen Victoria statue down here in front of the legislature got red paint on it, there was sort of a real tilt in public opinion. Like, have these folks gone too far? Like, come on, really, is this what are we're losing kind of the integrity of the purpose. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, I can, John. So a number of things come to mind on that. First off, the group, the initial group that organized the event at the legislature on June 11th were all Caucasian white settlers, colonialists, whatever you want to call us, and my wife was who had been at the front lines. She was the only one of that group that was at the front lines, and she said, "Hey, we got to involve the Indigenous people here. This is all about them. We're going to have a big rally at the legislature right in front of the display of the 215 graves sites that were found at Kamloops, and not mention the Indigenous people. Like, come on." So she pushed and pushed and pushed, and she lined up a lot of the people, a lot of the Indigenous people, including Katie, Bill Jones's niece, Katie, and they kind of took over a little bit. There was some of the organizers who were not happy. I wasn't. I thought these young people have every right. They are so angry. They are really, really furiously angry at the treatment that the natives have received from the colonials, the settlers. Give me a minute here, because if you think of Kipling and White Man's Burden, and the Queen Victoria has got to go out under this colonialism, and we got to civilize all these savages all over the world. That's what the British colonialism was all about. Okay, that's one thing, but to come and have genocide, which is what we did, and I will argue.
But you're tying now this residential school situation and everything else into
Absolutely.
something that was a public act that upset local First Nations because it was disrespectful as a protest on their property without their sanction. It's a different issue.
It upset the band councils, not necessarily the members. That's one of the complaints about the Patchett Act, is that the band council aren't even consulting with their own members. They are making decisions. And so if you go out and actually went on the street and interviewed some of the younger members of the Songhees and the other local groups, the Malahats, and any of them, they're probably fully in support of it.
We have a government now with John Horgan, who I know has fallen into disfavor with the protesters, because I guess their expectations were higher with an NDP government. But, what could John Horgan do now that would please you other than give you 100% of what you want? I mean, it sounds to me like it's all or nothing as far as the protesters go. And I don't know that really gets a lot of sympathy from the wider public, who really do want us to keep old growth for the most part.
Well, I haven't actually seen the polling results or if there's been any polling, but there is a general belief among our group now, we're on one side of this, but that upwards of 90% of British Columbians are fully supportive of the preservation of old growth forests. And that doesn't surprise me. 75, 80, 90, a significant majority of us are recognizing it. But so let's talk politics, because that's what I do know. So we start with John Horgan. He's a brown New Democrat, as opposed to a green New Democrat. I first came across John Horgan when he was a 19-year-old ministerial assistant to a minister of, I've forgotten what it was, industrial development or energy, mines, petroleum resources, one of those brown ministries. And he's been a brown New Democrat all his life. So he's sympathetic to industry. And you say, what could he do? He could get his cabinet and in 24 hours sit down, pass an order in council declaring a 2-year moratorium on all old growth harvesting, and get the lieutenant governor to sign it, and it becomes an order in council. You know what an order in council is. So how simple they are to do. So that's what we want. And so why doesn't he do it? Well, let's see. He is strategically, politically positioning himself to get reelected. New Democrat premiers are not very successful at being reelected.
Well, he just won a massive election.
Yeah. But he wants to beat Bennett and get elected next whatever. So it's the ego. No, but so he looks at it and he screwed the Green Party by calling a snap election. Wouldn't even give them time to elect representatives in all the ridings. So he's marginalized the Green Party, and now he's going after the moderate liberals. And so the Liberal Party's in disarray. And so if he goes, he's pro-industry, pro-logging. It's a strategic political move, and he's losing a lot of his New Democrat supporters, but not enough that he'll lose lose support among the diehard New Democrats. He's marginalized the Greens, and now he's going after the moderate liberals. So this is nothing but pure politics.
Well, I'd like to talk and sort of allude to the economics of all this. Okay. And I've had these discussions. You talked about the Green Party down here, and I've had many discussions with Adam Olson, a few with Elizabeth May around. I understand the objectives of your environmental objectives and climate change objectives. What are the economic consequences of these policies? In other words, if we stop forestry, where are the folks currently in those jobs? How are they going to get work? And so a bit of that is happening in sort of a microcosm in the Ferry Creek. Optically, people are going, First Nations, they need to work. You're stopping them from earning a living. How does that work out for you? What are your comments on that?
Well, first off, John, I have to correct you on. We're not against logging at all. We're against the harvesting of the old growth only. There's second growth, third growth. We've got sustainable logging. We've had the practices not terribly successfully, but there's enough old growth out there that they could. That there's not a logging company in the world that couldn't make money, especially in this market. So there's lots of jobs. There's lots of old growth harvesting to be done. The revenues from the forest industry, I've heard that if you subtract from the revenues the cost of fighting forest fires, that it's actually costs us money to harvest to have logging. It doesn't pay for itself, the forest industry. So Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Do you know that there are more people employed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania making solar panels than there are making steel?
I didn't, and that's great. That's a good statistic to hear.
and I grew up in the Kootenays. I grew up in Trail. The chemical plants there, they relied entirely on the ore from the Sullivan Mine in Kimberley. Well, the Sullivan Mine, guess what? It ran out of ore. And so now Kimberley has repositioned itself as a tourist town. They got old Bavarian buildings and facades, and it's a successful. The world is changing. The world is changing, John.
Sounds to me like a guy who had a triple bypass surgery has really found his heart on this issue.
Well, I'm glad I didn't have another heart attack. I got so angry sometimes. But you know, yeah. Thanks. Thanks. That's a sweet thing to say, Robin.
Wow, what a fascinating discussion, Robin. To sort of feel like you're right up there in the milieu. Didn't agree with everything he was saying. However, he said it with such passion, conviction, and provided me with a lot of food for thought.
You know, I knew Paul Nicholson would be a great guest. He is a thoughtful guy. You're right. We don't necessarily agree with him on everything, but he articulates his position so well, and we really thank him for coming on the show. And it's great to see he's fully recovered from his surgery.
Right, totally.
You don't take this stuff for granted. And it reminds me that we've had some sad passings recently. Over a couple of weeks, two vital men have left us, and I'd like to say goodbye to those two people who've made such a big difference to us on Vancouver Island. The first up is Graham Roberts, who for years attended our monthly boys' lunch, about 20 years altogether, long been known as the King of Quips. And Graham was once the mayor of Nanaimo, rebranding that community, the Harbor City, a great personality, passing at the age of 89. And also leaving us all too soon, Michael Coleman, former mayor of North Cowichan, who left his mark in that community and the whole island with steady leadership, and later in life was also witty and entertaining with his penmanship, particularly online. Mike was only 78. Our condolences to their families.
You know, Robin, my father passed away recently. I know this feeling, and want to extend a special thanks, a unique thanks to a good friend of mine and yours, that being Chris Coleman. Michael was his brother. Chris, we extend our sincerest condolences to you and your family, and hope that you're doing okay during these difficult times.
That's really well said, John. And Chris, we're so sorry about your loss. And one of the ways that you can deal with the terrible burden of loss is to go for a long walk or hike.
Yeah.
Relieve some of the stress that we've all been under this last COVID year. And it's great that there are trails all over Vancouver Island. And we're now going to be talking about this whole network of trails that you can explore. They go all the way from Oak Bay to the northern tip of Vancouver Island. And joining us now in the Rumble Room is the president of the Trail Association, Liz Bicknell. And welcome, Liz Bicknell, to the Victoria Rumble Room. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks, John. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm thrilled at any opportunity to talk about a trail. It's something I'm very, very passionate about.
And talking about a trail, did I read correctly? It's 770 kilometers of trail in totality. I mean, it goes all the way from Anderson Park in Oak Bay all the way up to Cape Scott on Northern Vancouver Island. I mean, that's a lot of trekking.
It is a huge amount of trekking. It'll be closer to 800 kilometers by the time we're done. And it is an amazing opportunity. And we're really, really, we're so close. We're about 90% done. And it's really quite amazing because all of this has been done through volunteer workers, including the board. We're a working board, and nobody is paid a cent.
Liz, on numerous other shows, we talk about the West Shore. We talk about development out there and how it's exploding. And what they call this West Shore corridor includes Souk, of course. And I know a lot of people like to hike in the Souk Hills. They post pictures on Facebook, and it all looks very exciting. I imagine there are plenty of trails out there that are part of your system. Is that a favorite place of yours to go for hikes, or members of yours to go for hikes?
It is. I love the Souk Hills. We go out there very, very often. I actually lead a hike myself up Braden. And we have many hikes that people could do locally, but I wouldn't suggest that the Souk Hills would be a trip that people would look at if they're just beginners.
Mm-hmm.
And what's so important is
That'd be me.
Right, me too.
Well, I will take you out on a hike, Robin, which will be a beginner's hike, you and your lovely wife, and we'll go at it slowly, because that's how you put people off. If you say to people, oh my goodness, you need to come out for 6 hours, which I can do 3 times a week, I will do 4, 5, 6 hours.
Whoa!
That actually puts people off. And you have to start slowly in order to see whether you like it, because hiking is not for everybody, believe me.
Now, I understand that at least some of the routes in the Souk Hills particularly, this may apply in other parts of the island, there are paths that are approved and there are paths that are not. There's CRD paths that people are encouraged to walk on. There's other trails that people are actually discouraged to walk on. Is that an issue?
It's not really an issue for us, because, and I can understand why they're protecting land out there, because of course you've got the reservoirs, and our drinking water is so hugely important to us. I'll tell you an issue that we have to deal with, and it's something that we're working very, very closely on, and that is the privately held timberlands that we got on the island. And when you look at Souk, some of our trail is there, but largely we're going up the spine of Vancouver Island. And our trail used to be called the Vancouver Island Spine Trail, but that was confusing for people, because when you think of spine, you think of the backbone, you think of medical, and you go off on a totally different tangent. So what we're looking at doing is building a trail that will go through and weave through all of the communities, or a large part of the communities, right up the backbone of the island. And we do come across privately held forest lands under the umbrella of Mosaic, Island Timbers, Timberlands, for example. And we have a memorandum of understanding with them. They give us access to their land. We are extremely respectful of it. And that's how we actually deal with those issues, where obviously if it's private land, you have to respect that.
Actually, Liz, that was a question I was going to ask you. Fantastic. Thank you for answering. You can read my mind this morning. But as an add-on to that, as a follow-up, how, and it's very, very topical these days, at least for us, that being First Nations land. How do you incorporate, manage, deal with trails on that land?
Well, I was remiss right at the very beginning of this. I should have said that I respectfully recognize that I'm actually on the lands of the Lekwungen speaking people. And I'm very, very grateful for that. We are actually working with the Indigenous communities, with the Indigenous folk. That is hugely, hugely important to us. And I go back, I used to work with government, and I've got many, many years under my belt with government. And when we were creating the Great Bear Rainforest, I worked with a marvelous, marvelous individual, an Indigenous gentleman. He headed up the Nanwakolas nation, and his name was Dallas Smith. And when I told Dallas about our trail, what he said in his inimitable fashion was, "Darling, anything that brings us closer together is a good thing."
Yeah.
And that's what our trail does. We have a responsibility, especially today. I mean, we've just come through a Canada Day like no other Canada Day that I have experienced, where I personally sat with my grief and sharing that grief with the Indigenous populations. My background is Irish, and we in Ireland have a pretty dark history like we have here. And I lay the blame at the Catholic Church, at the feet of the Catholic Church. They have a lot to answer for. We need to sit with our grief and join our Indigenous neighbors, and we need to learn to walk together on this land. And I believe our trail provides that opportunity to us. I really, really do.
I was just thinking, everybody keeps talking about ecotourism, and they talk about First Nations often in the same breath. Is this not something that could become a commercially viable thing? I'm not saying if you want to go for a weekend walk or a hike for, a half an hour or an hour or two, that's not the same thing. But if you wanted a guided tour or to go on an overnight trip, you might want a guide, and maybe that guide would be First Nations. Are these things that are being wrestled around? Is that something that's been considered?
Absolutely, Robin. And just recently in our Times Colonist paper, there was a lovely article about the Indigenous peoples and their marine trail. And I've actually reached out to the Songhees. You had Christina Clark on with you the other day, an absolutely wonderful woman. And I want to work with her to do something similar with our own trail. So we're potentially looking at partnering with them so that we can find mutually respectful opportunities where we can actually share. We need to find economic opportunities for them. So, for example, signage would be one opportunity. Guiding would be another opportunity. Around the Cowichan Lake, we've got a lake to traverse. Well, that would be a super opportunity to have Indigenous guides take you there. Another example, Robin, could be, right now our trail goes along the Galloping Goose because the ENN trail had not been completed. But we could easily add that, and it would connect to the Songhees Wellness Center. And that, of course, brings in wonderful cultural opportunities as well.
Oh, yeah.
So in the past, we worked with the Indigenous communities, and nobody has objected, but nobody has specifically taken the time to reach out to them and say, do you want to work with us? What are your worldviews? What are your ways of knowing? What does this mean to you? And I've had several meetings with Christina and some of her elders, Cecilia Dick being a wonderful woman as well. Mm-hmm. And they seem really interested in working with us. And I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled about that.
That's very encouraging. That's great information. Liz, as a final word, where do we learn more about these trails? Where do we find out how we can utilize them, how I can start at the first rung of the ladder of a hiking journey? How could a person get involved in building new trails on the island?
Well, our website would be the place that I would direct people to, John, which is vi-trail.ca. It's a fairly, I would say, user-friendly, as is always the case. We can do more, and we will be doing more with our website, because our vision would be, if you just wanted to do a small section, you'd go and you tap on that, and not only would you see the trail that you wish to hike, but you'd see all of the ancillary benefits that are available to you within that community. And this is where we'll be working with regional districts, working with Indigenous peoples to provide those opportunities. And now that we're 90% complete, we're starting to look at those bigger opportunities. What are the journeys people might want to take? Who can we partner with? And I will say that the provincial government is on board with us. They're hugely, hugely helpful. There's nobody really who would say this is not a good thing.
And when they say take a hike, it's with the best of intentions.
Well, it is totally. And you know what? That is our mantra as well, Robin. And thank you for raising that. One of our taglines is just hike it. And it doesn't have to be. There are only 6 people who have through hiked it, which takes about 2 to 3 months. But mostly what we're focusing on are the small little sections in our own backyards where people can go with their families, introduce them to nature, and look at the opportunities. There's wellness that comes with it, both physical and mental.
I just love Liz Bicknell's enthusiasm. And, that's a woman on the move.
Yeah.
She, in more ways than one, she's retired from government. She's gone out and got herself a master's degree at Royal Roads. She hikes like crazy every week. She's just a growing concern. And she's a great example, John, for us all to follow.
Absolutely, man. I've never hiked in my life. I do now. Well done. That was a great interview, and really reflective of some positive things going on the island. Talking about issues, talking about positive things. As we begin to wrap up another Rumble Room, Robin, I'd like to promote who's coming up next week. Mike Kazukowski. Many of you have heard of him. Many of you read of him. CEO of Citified Victoria, totally linked into the development of the city, the West Shore, the entire Lower Vancouver Island. Well, I can ask him questions. Is development coming too quickly? Are the buildings too big? Are we getting too much density? Maybe not. Does Greater Victoria actually have a capacity to move people, goods, services around this exploding region? Mike has the answers, and we're so pumped that he's coming on board to tell us what's going to go on in the next 20 years.
Really looking forward to that, John. And now we come to the time in the show, John, where you explain how people can support this show, how you can link in, you can share us, you can tell people about the show, and keeping in mind, we're just doing this for fun. We're not doing this for any kind of income, and we're not paying out a big budget. We're not paying out for big advertising. We're just doing this for our community. And how can people link in with us, John?
Yeah, totally. And, in previous episodes, of which there are now 16 of them, I've explained all of the different ways. Well, what's going to happen is that you'll see the links above us, below us. I don't know where those texts eventually show up. That's right. So rather than just list them out, let's talk about one of them today. And we'll focus on one with each upcoming show. Let's talk about the Facebook page. So that's facebook.com/Victoria Rumble Room. We have about 300 followers, which is pretty good. We'd like to see that go up. Why do we want to see that go up? It's because we think that we're digging a little deeper into these social, economic, arts and culture issues around Lower Vancouver Island. And we've had a really great response. So think about joining our page. You get notified of all the new episodes, but you particularly get notified of what we call the rants and our editorials, which interestingly enough have been getting more reach, more views than some of our shows. Oh my God. Anyway, what remains the same, from my lair in Saanich, from my position as the Croatian sensation, my name is John Juricic.
And I am Robin Adair, and rumble on!